All right. How many of you folks have had Eric Holmeyer at your site? Eric's been an application consultant for 8 or 9 years. We have folks there. Eric's been there. Yep, I'm seeing some hands. Okay. So Eric's been an application consultant for close to 9 years. He's managed our application consultants as well. He's done project management. He's been an Adept administrator at 3 different Adept customers. So long history with Synergis. Please join me in welcoming Eric Holmeyer to talk about disaster recovery and Adept.
Thanks, Scott.
Yep.
Okay, so as Scott said, lots of experience. I've been working with the software in one fashion or another for 20 years. I've been an application consultant, pretty much done everything from pre-implementation all the way out to managing the software for a few years. So I've gotten really familiar with the software, and I've been in several different situations, and this happens to be a subject for me that is very kind of near and dear to my heart, and mostly because I've lived it. Disaster recovery. I've had to get one set up because we were affected by it. So it's one of those things that I'm used to doing. I'll just move right into this, because Todd kind of stole some of my thunder. So what is a disaster recovery plan? Right? The disaster recovery plan is a set of procedures that you put in place that protect your business critical information from what is known and unknown disasters. They can range from anything. It can range from a simple accident down the road that takes out a transmission tower, could be electrical surges, could be natural disasters. We've kind of hit a bunch of those lately, as Todd kind of hit on. This was the worst year for tropical storms and hurricanes. Really bad. Has anyone here been affected by natural disasters? Their servers go down? So a few, right? 9/11 was a big one. Let me just pass over here. Earthquakes, floods, right? 9/11 was the one for me. And I was working with a customer at the time who had system go down. That's when I actually came up with this particular plan. It kind of got a little modified as we've moved along. But 9/11, everything. New York City was down. This particular customer had 2 locations, one in New York, one in Chicago. Even though Chicago was able to get onto their servers, they were not able to get to Adept. Adept was down, and that was affecting them big time. So there was a whole uptime for them that they had to get back up and running and get things moving along. Right? So disaster recovery is something that we all are going to face at some point or another, and hopefully we don't, but the potential of it is always there. And we don't know where it's going to come from, and we don't know how it's going to get there, right? Disaster recovery can be anywhere from how long do I need to get my information back? That's what I consider disaster recovery. When I think about how I'm going to build a disaster recovery plan, I think about if my systems go down now, how long do I need to get back up and running before it starts costing me money? Right? Also, how far back can I go in my data in order to get that back up and running? How busy are we? How many drawings do we do in an average hour, few hours, things like that? If I go back a day, is that satisfactory for us? Is the workflow that we do, is that enough that if I go back a day, it's okay? Or do I need to go back as low as 15 minutes? Right? And it seems like 15 minutes, but there's a lot that can happen in 15 minutes. 15 minutes, someone could have signed in 30 drawings. Right? So when I look at disaster recovery, I think about how far back do I need to go? How far back does my data retention need to be? Then you have to consider things like, do we go offsite? And the cloud, perfect example of where I can go offsite for a much different cost. I can get that offsite, not even have to worry about it. Those are all options. Whether it has to be offsite or onsite, do we need to back up our stuff and take it home and bring it back? Right? The 9/11 one, to give you an idea of where the plan kind of started, what we ended up doing was we ended up building a exact replication of the server in Chicago. And then what happened was what we set up was there's a server and database and vault and all of that in New York. And then there's a exact replication of all of that in Chicago. Now this is a long time ago, and it's pre our replication vault situation, right? So now we have replicated vaults. Back then we didn't, so we were using a completely separate replication. And what we do is replicate files over. And I'll kind of run through a sample of what that looks like. So we have a typical Adept server. You have your database, the Adept server, and the vault, or hub now. That is the beauty of replication. Right. The Adept workstation, user goes to log in. They get their normal login screen, nothing special. They connect to the Adept server. They go to sign files out from the vault. It all comes from their local location. Then we have that, for example, Chicago server in a second location. It's an exact replica, as I mentioned before. It's got the Adept server. It's got the satellite. And then it's got a SQL vault as well. Right? You can use SQL to replicate. I don't know if anyone uses the SQL tools, but SQL actually has a built-in replication as well. And you can have it even back up incrementally every 5 minutes. I've got folks that do even sooner than that. And then using the replication tool, the vault, you can actually replicate the files to the satellite. Now the Adept server in this situation is not actually running. It's set up to go, it's configured to connect to SQL, it's configured to connect to the vault. But in this particular environment, it's not actually running. Because at this time, we still only support one server. When you log in to connect, users are still going to connect to the Adept production. So the server gets replicated. But let's say it happens. We all don't want to be here. But the server just blew up. What are we going to do? How are we going to get this solved? You simply change the satellite vault to a hub. It's a configuration within AFS, if anyone's familiar with AFS. Is anyone here using AFS? Yeah, quite a few. Are anyone using replication? Okay. So the files get replicated. If you're familiar with it, you open up the dialog box, it's just a checkbox that says this is a hub. All right? So in that disaster situation where everything just stops and users can't get in, simply go to the other server, your disaster recovery server, start up the Adept service, restore the SQL database, change the vault from a satellite to a hub. Okay. And then what's different now, the user goes to log in, you just need to notify them and say, listen, we need to connect to your second login. It's the same login, but it's a different data source. You can have multiple data sources on the same installation on your machine. So you simply change it to, well, I've got it listed here as disaster recovery. You can call it whatever you want to, alternate login, whichever you need to have. But the user logs into there, and the difference is now they connect to the Adept server in that disaster recovery location. When they go to sign out files, the files come from now the hub, which used to be the satellite. Replication has kind of made this whole thing kind of come together. Before that, we were replicating files, but based on when you replicated and file date and time, there was always a little bit of a kind of snafu in there that we had to kind of worry about. The way that AFS works is it tracks the date and time at each location between hub and satellite. So now when you do that switch, it already knows this is the file, this is the latest one we have at this location, this is the date and time. So when I do that, users are able to just immediately start signing out. The time it takes to switch in this environment is just minutes. Aside from the time it took me to find out that the server was down, and it took users to call, and if you know your users, that probably didn't take very long either, right? So I go in, I start everything back up. You're talking minutes. If you've got Publish Wave or the web browser, they also work in a similar fashion. I've got both of them running at a second location. I just need to hook those up. Publish Wave takes a little bit more because now you've got to point Publish Wave inside of the client. You got to tell it to log into the other Publish Wave. Right? But within 15, 20 minutes, I'm up and running. My users are logging in, and I can go from there. When it comes back to getting the server back up and running, then you just simply take what you have over here, switch it back, make the other one a satellite, let them get their updates. You can push date and time. You can actually tell it to push the files and update files and replicate on demand from the server. Re-update the satellite. When you have everything there, you can actually switch it back later on back to a hub again, spin the server back up, turn the other one off, and continue working. You just need to tell everyone to change their login now back to their normal login and say we're back up and running. Right? We've run into this a few different times. We also had a client, Patty can remember, they went completely down. Their hard drives were fried, and unfortunately they didn't have backups. And it takes months to get those repaired if anyone's had to do that. And it's not a guarantee repair. You know, if your whole RAID goes, which is what happened, it takes a lot to get that back. And that's a time, that's a cost, that's a money value in there that you have to look at when it comes to should we get disaster recovery. So the impact on no DR plan. Right? Productivity gets halted. Users can't log into Adept. They can't get to files. Now, you can start giving them read-only access to the back door, but even that gives only a limited amount. And they've got to look for files. They've got to find them. Then you have that whole process of if they get copies of that file, when you get back up and running, they got to take all those files and assume ownership, put them back in, or acquire checkout. Project timeline delays. How long does it take to get those files? As I mentioned, when the hard drive situation, you're out weeks, maybe months. The customer that was affected by the hurricane several years ago, they were out almost 2 months with nothing before they were able to get everything restored back and try and get their files rebuilt and a location set up that they could get a server going. So the cost of emergency assistance to restore your lost data, getting those hard drives restored, not cheap. And again, not always guaranteed. Contractual legal issues due to delays, lost opportunity costs, the impact on credibility, because now you're behind on projects, you're falling behind, you're falling late, manufacturing's not getting things out. There are a lot of effects by not being able to get to your files. Consideration for disaster recovery. Where would you store your recovery server? That's always a really big one because depending on what happens, and as Jessica said, it was nice to have that completely off-site. As I mentioned, in New York to Chicago, the server's in a completely different area. I've got another customer who's got one in London versus one in Maryland. So if one goes down, it's a completely different area, not affected by whatever happened to the first one. You might use an off-site server location. You might use the cloud. I think the cloud is a really good one, depending on security issues and things like that and whether or not you feel about your data being up there, but it is a really good environment to have. What impact will this have on the current structure of the vaults? And how does that get your files and where are they going to be? And can I restore them in a fashion that they are the same and they link up the same and the files are all updated? What is the impact on your other office locations when the users of Adept is down? So it's not even just affecting you, it affects other locations, it affects vendors, it affects manufacturers, it affects other people that are involved in your product. It's not even just at your location. And as I mentioned before, what is that need for disaster recovery timeline? What is the timeline I need to be back up and running? At what point from when we went down to where we get back up and running does it start to really cost us money? And do you have IT participation? IT participation is very important, and you need to have IT to help you with that. You need to have their involvement. They need to be there because that's who's going to get everything set up. But it's not even just the initial setup. Right? One of the things that I recommend when it comes to disaster recovery is that you test disaster recovery and that you make sure that it's working on a regular basis, whether that be a quarterly, whether it be a half a year or once a year. You need to have those checks in balance. For example, the one where I mentioned the hard drive that failed, they thought they had backups. They thought they had everything secure. They thought everything was good. And they had been running for many, many years to find out that they had no backup. The backups that they had were not set to run on open files. They weren't getting those. Right? Their plan for restoration and being able to bring everything back was not secure. And it's not just a simple, can you check the backup and make sure it's running? I always recommend you run through it. When I set up a disaster recovery plan, we immediately shut it down. Oh no, that screaming woman, everything just stopped. What do? Let's switch over to the other system. Let's go through that process. Did it work? Let's make sure someone can log in and get those files. Because that may work today, but something might happen. Servers move, things change. 6 months from now, that might get broken. A year from now, something happens, and then you're like, it's okay, we have disaster recovery. We're going to switch this back. Hold on a second. We're going to have to check this out. We're not going to be back up and running as quick as we thought we were. Right? So it's really important to check that out, and you need IT participation to make sure that that's happening. Right? Todd mentioned a really good thing about the 3 environments. I think it's really important that you have 3 environments. I always recommend it. In fact, I've recommended it probably to most of you here in passing at one point or another in the last 4 days. Extremely important. I can't express it. But that disaster recovery is kind of that 4th environment, in my opinion. You should have a test, a development, and then a production, and then a disaster recovery. And our licensing provides that for you, so you can do that and set that up and have that environment for you. But it's really crucial to make sure you do that before you go to any major release. And it's crucial that you have that before something bad does happen. We'll help you. We'll do everything we can to make sure that you get those back and make sure that you're up and running as fast as you can. But a good disaster recovery plan is extremely important, and you want to have that in place. So does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to talk about disaster recovery? No? Yeah, Nick.
You mentioned you recommend the 3 environments. Could you use your development or test environment for DR?
I would not necessarily, because you're making changes in those environments that you're not necessarily going to ever make in your production environment. So I could be working in test and go, yeah, I don't really like this. And I may stop where I'm at. You don't want to go back to that. The development is typically the same as production, but still there are times when you're in the middle of going through it and go, wait, never mind. Let's go back to test. This didn't work, right? So you don't want to get caught in the middle of that. That would be disastrous. You don't want to, if things go down, you're like, hey, I got a disaster recovery, let's go, let's get, development back over here and we'll copy it over, and that may not be 100%.
And then, can you speak about the importance of making sure that your database backup and your replication happens at the same time so that it's in sync?
Good point. That is extremely important. The information, the file, date, and time, and size, and all of that, that is tracked, right? So especially if you were in my admin class, I mentioned it like probably 7 or 8 times. We track everything by file name, date, time, and size. So if you restore a database that says the file was last updated 20 minutes ago, but the file you have that's restored actually has a date of 5 minutes ago, they no longer sync, right? So it is really important that everything kind of updates fast. So that's a good point. That is a very good point. Anyone else? Randy? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Does it support going back? What's the behavior if you reset, turn that back to a satellite? Does it sync correctly?
So I always set mine when I do the tests. I always set my hub or my original server. I set that as a satellite, and then I make sure the files all resolve and make sure that all my date and times match again before I switch back again to a hub, right? Because if you just immediately switch back to a hub, the files haven't updated between the satellite and the hub, and then we run into all these mismatch things. So I always find it's better, it's not an immediate switch back. You may switch over to quick, but when you want to go back again, you need to make sure that everything's up to date again. And you could do that by pulling everything and manually doing it, but I'll just usually switch it as a satellite. And then, like I said, there's the ability to push replication. So I'll then go in and say, okay, go look for all those and start pushing them to update them. When I know that everything is in and it's all good and all those file dates and times match again, then I'll take the system down, start up the other one, switch it to a hub again, and that's when I'll tell people that they can go. But the good thing is they're going to keep working, right? And then I will mention one other thing. If you're not familiar with AFS, we track where you're logging into by your MAC address and IP. So for the example that I used from New York to Chicago, when the New York people get back in and they start pulling files, if their server's not up and running yet, or they're working from a remote location, it may take them a little longer to sign out files, but they're still going to get the files. The difference is they'll be checking them out from Chicago and not from New York until that satellite is back up, right? Any other questions? Chris?
No, I got one here. I guess just a comment first off. It's a great topic, but if there is a disaster, your uptime for your Adept environment might be number 5 on the list. So,
True.
Keep in mind from your organization perspective, you should understand where that is and how long it's going to be.
Right.
We do have a plan, but I do question, is there a document or a template that you have that I can go back and challenge my IT department, because my confidence in their plan is pretty low.
I don't think we have an actual document to this, a white paper, other than the presentation. I have a one-sheet piece that gives a diagram similar to this that I usually hand out. We can get that to you. That is a good point, too. Do you know if you have a disaster recovery plan? And if you don't know you have a disaster recovery plan, you should go back and see what it is. And then again, look at the same things. Is it going to be the time frame that we need? Is the disaster recovery solid? Have we run through testing it and making sure it's going to work? And you're right, it's not always. But it all depends on the disaster, on how important getting Adept back up and running is. And some people are in facilities, so their drawings might be a little bit more important to get to. It kind of has to deal with what your data is and where you're at. If your facility is not there and you have nowhere to go, that is definitely not the highest priority, for sure, right? Good question. I see one in the back. Nick?
So I recently recommended that one of my clients test the DR, and rather than being in a huge hurry to switch back to the original, why not just leave the DR the new primary and then take your time, set up what was to be the new DR? What do you think about that?
Now that's an interesting concept, actually. Yeah, why not? I mean, you're still signing your files out. I think it has to do with, I think that really comes up to whether they are comfortable with the primary location for that vault being at a different location or not. Sometimes corporate wants everything current and the truth of everything to be on their servers. But the reality of it is yeah, there's no reason not to. Once you make that transition and everything is working and you're getting those files back and forth, when let's say that New York, Chicago, for example, right? If we turned on Chicago and then that just became the current database for now, folks in New York would just start working. And once their satellite is back up and running, they're going to be pulling from local anyway for their files. Is that
Very
it?
much, Eric.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.